inflation, right? It's everywhere you turn, and it's hitting everyone's wallets pretty hard.
Yeah.
You don't need, like, an economics degree to feel it, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things you feel in your everyday life.
Totally.
Yeah.
So we're doing this deep dive, and we're really trying to go beyond those, like, scary headlines about inflation. We've got this super in-depth report, an in-depth analysis of the contributions of recent U.S. administrations to current inflation.
It's a mouthful, I know.
Quite a title.
It is. But alongside that, we've got this other note with kind of a different perspective. So we're really going to try to understand what's going on.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the blame game with inflation, but honestly, I think it's way more interesting to really dig into how we got here. Absolutely. So instead of just pointing fingers, we want to uncover those economic forces, like during the Trump and Biden administrations, and kind of get to that aha moment.
Yeah, and it's always more complex than it seems, right?
Always. So to start things off, let's talk about how inflation actually works. You hear these terms thrown around, CPI, PCEPI. What's the deal with those?
Okay, so imagine you're at the grocery store, right? The CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, that's basically like tracking the price of your weekly shopping cart over time. It shows us how much the cost of like everyday stuff is going up.
Makes sense.
And then you've got the PCEPI, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. And that's the one that the Federal Reserve really watches closely. It's less about your grocery bill and more about all your spending habits combined. So think groceries, gas, entertainment, the whole shebang.
Okay, so it's not just about one single number then. It's more like looking at it from different angles to get the whole picture.
Exactly. And when we, look back through history using these measures, we see this kind of ebb and flow to inflation. Like you have the crazy high inflation of the 70s, the great inflation, remember that. Then things kind of calmed down in the 80s and 90s, the Great Moderation, they called it.
Mm-hmm.
And then after 2008, after the financial crisis, inflation was almost too low for a while there.
Right, which makes the current situation feel even more intense, right? Like we went from a light drizzle to a full-blown economic hurricane.
That is a perfect analogy. But yeah, to understand this hurricane, we got to rewind a bit back to the Trump administration. Let's talk policies and if anything during that time might have, set the stage for what we're seeing today.
Okay, so rewind time. The Trump years were, how do I put this? A bit of a roller coaster economically speaking. You had the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, a massive tax cut, and the goal was basically to supercharge the economy.
Right. The thinking was put more money in the hands of businesses and people, and hopefully that leads to more investment and economic growth. It's that classic trickle-down theory.
Okay, so the million-dollar question, did it work? Did it help, or did it actually feed into the whole inflation problem?
Well, it's tough to say for sure what the long-term impact will be. What we do know is those tax cuts definitely led to a bigger deficit. The Congressional Budget Office estimated it would increase the deficit by something like $1.5 trillion over 10 years.
Wow, that's a huge chunk of change. And then, beyond the tax cuts, there were also those tariffs. Trump was a big fan of tariffs, especially on goods coming from China. He said it was about protecting American jobs. But how did those tariffs play into the whole inflation situation?
So tariffs, right, they're basically taxes on imported goods. The goal might have been to give domestic manufacturing a boost, but they also made things more expensive for businesses and people here in the U.S.
Because suddenly those everyday things you need, they just cost more.
Yeah, exactly. And then on top of that, you had the ripple effects on those global supply chains.
Right, because everything is connected.
Exactly. You can't just change one thing in the global economy without it impacting everything else. Companies had to scramble, finding new suppliers, shifting production around, and all of that just added more costs and complexity.
It's like a domino effect almost. One thing leads to another, and it just keeps going.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. And then on top of the tariffs, you also had the Trump administration's push for deregulation. They wanted to cut what they saw as like overly burdensome regulations on industries, think finance, environment, labor. The hope was to, again, encourage more investment.
Okay, so a lot going on. Tax cuts, tariffs, deregulation. It sounds like a recipe for, well, inflation. But here's the thing. During the Trump years, inflation stayed pretty low, didn't it? Why was that?
Yeah, that's an important point. Inflation was actually hovering around that 2% target. Now, there are a few ideas about why it didn't go crazy. One factor is probably globalization. We were living in a world where goods flowed pretty freely across borders, and those cheaper imports, especially from China, they helped keep prices down here.
So it's almost like the global economy was acting as a kind of pressure valve. right? Preventing things from getting too overheated.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And we can't forget about technology either. All those advancements in automation and data analysis, those helped boost productivity and probably helped offset some of those rising costs.
Mm. Okay, so maybe a bit of a grace period then. But like you said before, these policy decisions, they can have these like delayed effects.
Yeah.
So were the Trump years setting the stage for the inflation we're seeing now? Were we just living in this like calm before the storm?
That is the million-dollar question, right? And to answer it, we need to shift gears and look at how the Biden administration approached things, especially with that whole COVID-19 pandemic happening right as he took office.
Yeah, talk about a curveball, right?
Yeah. A curveball is putting it lightly. Biden had to step in just as, like, the entire global economy was getting flipped on its head.
And their answer to that was the American Rescue Plan, which was, well, it was a pretty big deal, right? $1.9 trillion, all aimed at softening the blow from COVID.
Yeah, it was a huge gamble.
Yeah.
You know, like pumping that much money into the economy all at once. Remember those stimulus checks everyone got?
Oh, yeah.
That was a core part of the plan. The idea was to get cash directly to people,
Yeah.
Try to boost demand and keep businesses from going under.
Right, which is a totally different strategy than those Trump tax cuts we were just talking about.
Yeah.
This was more about, like, immediate relief, right, like putting out a fire.
Exactly. And to be fair, it probably did help us avoid a complete economic meltdown. But, and this is a big but, you had this huge wave of money flooding the system right at the same time as those supply chains were already struggling because of the pandemic.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So it's like not ideal timing.
Not ideal at all. Like you're trying to start the car, but the parking brake is still on. You might get a jolt, but you're not going anywhere good.
Ouch, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
And on top of the American Rescue Plan, you also had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was another $1.2 trillion this time for roads, bridges, broadband internet, all that good stuff.
Yeah, infrastructure always seems to be that thing that everyone can agree on, right? Like, yeah, we need better roads, obviously. But even if everyone agrees, it's still a tightrope walk, right? Trying to figure out how much spending is too much, especially with inflation already becoming a concern.
Totally. It's a delicate balance, for sure. And then, of course, you had Biden pushing for the Build Back Better plan, which was his big social spending package.
Right.
That one ended up stalling in Congress, so it's really hard to say what impact it might have had on inflation if it had passed.
Okay, so we've got stimulus spending, we've got infrastructure, and all of this is happening while the Federal Reserve is doing its thing in the background. What were they up to during all of this? I mean, were they still trying to walk that tightrope between jobs and prices?
Yeah, the Fed, they had a really tough job during this time. Remember that dual mandate we talked about earlier?
Hmm.
Keeping employment strong and keeping inflation under control.
Right, right. Two very different things.
Yeah, and in those early Biden years, the Fed, they were pretty sure that inflation was transitory is the word they kept using. They thought those supply chain issues would iron themselves out and then inflation would just kind of naturally go back to normal.
So they were okay with letting inflation run a little hot for a while, hoping it was just a temporary thing.
Exactly. They were really focused on the economic recovery from COVID, even if it meant putting up with higher prices in the short term. Now, of course, it's easy to look back and say what they should have done.
Yeah, hindsight is 20/20, as they say.
Exactly. But whether or not the Fed made the right call, that's still something economists are debating today.
It does seem like they were trying to land a plane in a hurricane.
Yeah.
Not exactly an easy thing to do. But let's zoom out a bit, right? We've been talking about the Biden administration, we've been talking about the Fed, but this whole inflation thing, it's not just an American problem, is it? It's global.
Absolutely not. It's a global issue. And the pandemic, well, that wasn't just an American problem either, was it?
Oh.
It was this huge global shock to every system.
Right.
Remember how we keep talking about those supply chains? Those aren't just national, It's this intricate web that stretches across the entire planet. And then COVID hit, and it was like someone just threw a wrench into those gears.
And suddenly everyone's stuck at home, ordering everything online, factories are shut down, and all those shipping containers are just piling up.
It was chaos. Total chaos. And unfortunately, chaos has a way of costing a lot of money. Those empty store shelves, remember those?
Oh, yeah.
The insane shipping costs. That's the global supply chain crisis playing out in real time.
It's wild to think about how quickly we all had to learn about container ships and global logistics.
Right.
But it wasn't just the pandemic, right? There were other things happening globally too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have to talk about oil. It's basically the fuel that keeps the global economy running, and when the price of oil jumps around, everyone feels it.
Right, makes sense.
At the very beginning of the pandemic, oil prices totally crashed,
Yeah.
because demand basically disappeared overnight. But then, as things started opening back up, the demand for oil shot back up, and the price followed, which, surprise, surprise, just made inflation even worse.
So it's like getting hit twice, basically.
Mhm.
First, the pandemic messes everything up, and then oil prices skyrocket.
Yeah, it was a 1-2 punch for sure. And then, on top of all that, you also have these geopolitical tensions simmering in the background this whole time. Like, remember the trade war between the US and China?
Yeah.
That started during the Trump administration, but it definitely continued in different ways under Biden. And that just added a whole other layer of uncertainty to the global trade situation.
Yeah, because you can't separate economic policy from, well, everything else that is happening in the world. It's all connected.
You got it. And then, of course, the war in Ukraine starts, which, first and foremost, is just a horrific humanitarian crisis. But it also sent shockwaves through the global economy, especially when it came to energy prices and food prices.
Right, right. So it really does feel like we're talking about this like perfect storm of factors, right? You've got domestic policies, you've got global disruptions, geopolitical uncertainty. But it feels like we've mostly been talking about all of this in a kind of, I don't know, anecdotal way. But this is where I want to bring in that report that you shared. It talks about econometric analysis, which sounds very official and complicated.
It does sound very official.
It does, but I have a feeling you can explain it to us normal people.
Oh, definitely. Econometric analysis, it's really just a fancy way of saying using data to tell a story.
Okay, I like that. I can get behind that.
Yeah. So it's kind of like detective work, They're looking for clues in the economic data to try and figure out what actually caused inflation to spike.
Okay, I like that analogy. So what were the clues? What kind of data did they look at, and what story did it tell?
They looked at a ton of data. I'm talking everything from government spending as a percentage of GDP, which basically tells you how much the government is spending compared to the size of the economy. They looked at money supply growth, which is basically how much money is circulating out there in the world. They even put together this supply chain pressure index using stuff like shipping costs and delivery times to try and measure just how much those global supply chain problems were messing with prices.
Wow, okay, so they've got all this data. What did they do with it? Like, how do you even begin to make sense of all that information?
That's where the econometrics comes in. They use these statistical models, basically just fancy equations, to see how all these different factors are related to each other. Like, if you imagine a giant puzzle, except instead of a picture, you get these insights into how the economy actually works.
Okay, so what kind of insights are we talking about? What were the big aha moments? What did they find?
So there were a few really interesting findings. First, they found a strong connection between all that fiscal stimulus, all that government spending, and inflation. In other words, all that spending that was supposed to help the economy recover. Well, it also looks like it played a role in driving up prices.
Okay, that makes sense. But there's a catch, right?
There is. They actually found that the type of stimulus mattered.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about how much money you spend, it's about how you spend it.
Exactly. Their analysis suggested that those direct payments to people that Biden was so keen on, those probably had a bigger and more immediate impact on consumer demand and therefore prices compared to those trickle-down style tax cuts that Trump favored. It's kind of like if you're trying to water your garden, right? You could use a watering can or you could use a fire hose.
Right, both will get the job done, but the fire hose is going to cause a lot more disruption.
Exactly. And speaking of disruption, remember that supply chain pressure index we talked about?
Oh, yeah.
Unsurprisingly, that had a huge impact on inflation. Those global supply chain disruptions we keep talking about, those were a major factor in driving up prices.
So basically, the data confirms what we were seeing play out in our everyday lives. Empty shelves, shipping delays, and prices going through the roof. It all adds up.
It all adds up. And of course, we can't forget about oil. The analysis found that those wild swings in oil prices and other commodities like that, those were a significant driver of inflation as well.
So it really is this perfect storm, isn't it? You've got domestic policies, you've got global disruptions, you've got geopolitical uncertainty. All of these things are colliding, and it's creating this pressure cooker for inflation.
It really is. And because it's all these different things at play, it's super hard to tease apart and say exactly how much each administration actually contributed. It's not as simple as Trump's policies caused this much inflation and Biden's caused this much.
Right, because it's not about placing blame or pointing fingers. It's about understanding how all of this is connected.
100%. And it's super important that we understand all of these different factors if we want to get a handle on inflation in the future. So with that in mind, let's actually dive into the nitty-gritty of comparing the Trump administration to the Biden administration. What were their main differences, and how did those differences potentially impact this whole inflation saga?
Okay, so let's get into it. When it comes to, like, the economy and how to handle it, Trump and Biden, they had some pretty different ideas, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like Trump, he was all about that supply side approach, cut taxes, get rid of regulations, and the idea is that if you make things easier for businesses, the investment will follow and everyone will eventually benefit.
Right, that whole rising tide lifts all boats thing.
Exactly.
But then you have Biden, and he seemed to be much more hands-on, especially with the whole pandemic happening right when he took office.
Absolutely. Biden's approach was a lot more like, what do they call it? Keynesian economics.
Oh, yeah.
More direct government spending, helping people directly, things like that. The idea there is that sometimes the government just needs to step in and boost demand, especially during a crisis.
Yeah, it's like two totally different philosophies, right?
Total opposite ends of the spectrum.
And when you look at their approaches to trade, that's another area where they really diverged.
Big time. Trump, he was all about those tariffs, especially on goods from China. He really wanted to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., but of course that also meant higher prices for a lot of stuff here.
Because let's be real, tariffs are basically just a hidden tax, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty much. And while Biden hasn't completely gotten rid of all the tariffs, he's definitely taken a softer approach, I'd say. More focused on diplomacy and working with other countries to figure things out.
Okay, so we've got different approaches to spending, different approaches to trade. But what about the Federal Reserve? How did each administration handle that whole thing? Because the Fed is its own beast, right?
It really is. And it's interesting because even with all their differences on other economic issues, both Trump and Biden, they were dealing with these crazy low interest rates. And that's something the Federal Reserve controls, not the president.
Right. The Fed's got its own thing going on. Their whole focus is keeping employment strong and keeping inflation under control, right?
Exactly. And whether or not it was the right move to keep interest rates so low for so long, even as inflation was starting to become a problem, well, that's still a hot topic.
Yeah. Hindsight, right? Always easier to see things clearly when you're looking back. But it's obvious that both Trump and Biden, they both had to deal with some seriously tough economic challenges. And COVID, that just threw a wrench into everything.
Totally. It's a good reminder that it's never as simple as just pointing fingers and saying, you messed up the economy.
Right.
It's just way more complicated than that.
It really is. It's about understanding all these different factors, like you were saying, the policies, the global events, even just how people are feeling about the economy. All of that plays into inflation.
100%. The economy is not some simple machine,
Not at all.
And I think for anyone listening who's maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all this talk about inflation, just remember, you're not alone in this. It's complicated.
We're all in the same boat here, right?
Yeah.
But the answer isn't to just throw our hands up and say, well, this is a mess.
Exactly.
It's about trying to understand how it all works so we can make smart decisions.
Yes. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
The more we understand about how inflation works, the more prepared we'll be to deal with these kinds of challenges in the future.
Well said. This deep dive has definitely helped me. I feel like I understand things a lot better now, and hopefully our listeners do too. But as we wrap up, I always like to leave everyone with something to think about, like a little thought-provoking question to keep those mental gears turning. What do you think? Any final words of wisdom for us?
Well, we've seen how both the Trump and Biden administrations, even though they took really different approaches, they both ended up having to deal with this huge inflation problem. It makes you wonder, right? Are the economic tools that we have, the ones we've been using for decades now, are those tools still enough in this world that's so interconnected and constantly changing? Something to think about.
That's a great question to end on. It's definitely a reminder that this conversation about inflation, about how we build an economy that actually works for everyone, well, it's far from over.
For sure.
And on that note, a huge thank you to you, our amazing expert, for walking us through all of this. It's been so insightful.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
And to our amazing listeners, thank you as always for tuning in. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into the forces shaping our world. Until then, keep those brains engaged.